All right, there we go. All right, welcome again to Controversies in Church History. This is the third interview we have done on Controversies in Church History. I am Derek Taylor. Welcome to our third interview, which we have a special guest this time. Hopefully you will enjoy. Our guest for this interview is Erick Ybarra. He is an apologist and author. He is the proprietor of a Patreon site, Classical Christian Thought, which you can find on Patreon. And he is the author of 5 books, The Church Fathers on Rebaptism, Baptismal Sacramentology, The Filioque, Revisiting the Doctrinal Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox, The Just Shall Live by Faith, Resolving the Catholic-Protestant Debate on Justification from Paul's Epistles to the Romans, Melchizedek and the Last Supper, Biblical and Patristic Evidence for the Sacrifice of the Mass. And then finally, the book we are going to talk about in this interview, mostly, the Papacy, Revisiting the Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox. So please welcome Erick Ybarra. Thank you for coming, Erick. We really appreciate it. Glad to have you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, hopefully, I hope our audience will get a lot out of this. So, first question about the book, The Papacy. Just the first thing, very basic. Why'd you write it? What was your motivation for this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Good place to start. So I was born into a Latino Spanish Catholic culture. So my family had me baptized into the Catholic Church around 6 months down in Miami Beach, Florida. And when I was raised, we went to church every Sunday, but my family was not very religious. We didn't talk about Christ outside of church. So in my teens, I had drifted into atheism, agnosticism, and various, anti-God philosophies. But when I hit university at the age of 18, I had a very powerful conversion experience. And it was into the Reformed some of the listeners here might balk at the idea of a Reformed Baptist, but the self-designated Reformed Baptist, which is just like a Baptist heritage with Calvinistic soteriology. Okay. And I was in there for years, and over the course of 5-6 years, around the 7th year, I started to travel the horizon of Christian denominationalism backwards in time. So I started to sit down with Lutherans, Anglicans. I eventually found a happy home in Anglo-Catholicism, at which point I found a lot of rest for my soul. I had been praying a lot, reading a lot, and talking with a lot of elite scholars all over the globe. And it was there as an Anglo-Catholic that I realized that I had not really completed my journey. And so I continued to read and wear my knees out in prayer at Mass. This is at the Anglican Church, is over here in Central Florida. Is a great Anglo-Catholic church at the Anglican Province of America.
Okay.
And so that brought me to the fork between Rome and Constantinople. And I had spent a lot of hours, pouring into the differences between the Byzantine claims and the claims of Rome. And I was in and out of seminary libraries, scanning pages of different books, different articles, different journals. And I just packed in a lot of research, and I did not want it to just rest in my memory, So that's when, after 10 years or so, I said, you know what, I need to put this on record, because at least for my children, when they get older and they face this question, they may freshly want to test and compete Catholicism against the other ancient alternative which is Eastern Orthodoxy, and I would want them to have a detailed examination already to start with, to get them going, to get the gallop going. Because when I was looking into it, Eastern Orthodoxy was barely on YouTube, and there weren't a lot of English authors that had all their works translated. And um, I was blessed to read Meyendorff, Florovsky, Schmemann, Avanasieff, and other authors, but none of them really, no Catholic author I had come across, with the exception of Dr. James Locutus. I have to mention him. But there weren't a lot. Yeah, there weren't a lot of avid Catholics looking into it, and then looking into it well. I saw a lot of surface treatments, and to not take anything away from them. That was the method at the time. Let's look at this. Let's look at the Florilegia of the Church Fathers. They all support Rome as chief and head. But since the 1930s, especially as we get into the 1980s, 1990s, the Eastern Orthodox have really developed their counter arguments, largely borrowed from Anglicanism, but they've been able to refine their objections. And I thought that some updated work needed to be done.
Oh, well, I can say for a fact, the thing that came to my mind reading your book, back to my graduate school days, I thought of William Laud. And I thought of William Laud because I remember his program for the reform of the Church of England he called thorough. And that is the one word that describes your book. It is extraordinarily thorough. And if, for our listeners, if you want to read a book on this book will cover everything. It covers everything quite literally and quite well. So excellent. Thank you for that. The good answer for that. Obviously, it's personal to you, obviously, this book and the subject and everything. I know you've had debates and everything with Eastern Orthodox. I didn't have a question on here. Let me see, how did I phrase this? Yeah, well, this is the questions you mentioned. You know a lot about their objections. What is the most compelling objection to papal authority you have heard from Orthodox interlocutors over the years, studying this, talking to them?
Yeah, so I think that they've got a box full of them, but definitely one of the strongest is to emphasize that in the first millennium, there are times where the Bishop of Rome, the Roman Pontiff, enters into some kind of a failure, whether it's in discipline or in doctrine, and the church can respond in a way that can go anywhere from strong letters of rebuke to even removal of the Pope's name from the diptycha on the altars of the church. And those events, that didn't happen often. Okay. It happened often with those who are outside the church. I'm talking, we may get into that. Those are the people who would not be identified with the Roman Byzantium communion. But you have these extremities that don't seem to fit with what dogmatic Catholic teaching insists upon, especially since Vatican Council I in 1870. And so basically what they'll say is, look, you have a few events in history where you've got the golden gun of papalism, and when you pull the trigger, it's supposed to come out with a one-shot kill. And what it looks like that comes out is a little flag that says bang. And so there are a couple of scenarios where that comes up, and a Catholic is forced to try and wrestle an explanation to establish coherence. so I think I emphasize that in the book. Situations surrounding Honorius, Vigilius, um, and especially those two, where an Orthodox can not rest, and keep bringing it up. Now, I don't think that grants victory or puts puts the victory on the Orthodox side, but I couldn't help but realize that they have that in their artillery. And for me to deny that, at least on the historical record, maybe not on the ecclesiastical record, but certainly I would argue it's on the ecclesiastical record. But just from the historical documentary evidence that we have, I cannot deny that objection, no power from the Orthodox, without being without sacrificing my honesty.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, this kind of gets into the next question. This is about. I'm assuming I don't know. I mean, most of my listeners probably know who Honorius is. This is usually the big objection, and I mean, I don't think until 10, maybe 15 years ago, I knew who Honorius was. I rarely ever heard of it. And so for our well, let me get the question. I wrote it down here. So yeah, this is. If you don't know my listeners, Pope Honorius, who was, and this does seem a little bit odd, but he was posthumously condemned by the Second Council of Constantinople in 681, as well as you detail in your book, other popes basically condemned him of being a heretic. So explain his case and how this comes about and how he gets condemned after he's dead.
Yeah. So that's important to realize, because one of the things that doesn't often get prefaced in this question of Honorius is the differences of apprehending ecclesiastical criminals in the 6th, 7th century versus the later post-Gratian medieval Western canonical tradition. There's a difference in the way that ecclesiastical crimes are apprehended. So in the 7th century, which is the century wherein Honorius lived, the church, I feel like I shouldn't say this, but I don't know any other way to say it other than it was a very premature administration of church discipline on heresy. So if somebody wrote a document that sounded like it sounded like it was heretical, then even 200 years after their death, the church at the time was in support, not without struggle, because it was a debate. There was a whole debate about this. They were in support of issuing posthumous anathemas. This concept actually gets resisted in early Rome. So Pope Leo the Great, for example, was totally against the idea because he quoted Matthew 16, Matthew 18, whatever you bind on earth, whatever you loose on earth. And his argument was that these people have already died in the peace of the church, and it's outside of the jurisdiction of the church. Well, anyhow, during Honorius's time, they were digging up sources from a few folks, one of them being a diamond light Saint Augustine of Hippo, in support of the idea that we can issue anathemas for people who had already deceased, and outside of a chance for them to answer for the accusation. So Honorius lived in at a time where a new heresy was brewing in the East. It was an attempt to unite the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians with the idea that, okay, Christ he may have one, he's one person. We all know he's one person, but he you say he has two natures, fine, but let's say he only has one operational energy, you know, and that idea gets floated between Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. The Patriarch of Jerusalem opposes it. There's a little bit of a conflict, so the Patriarch of Constantinople writes to Rome asking for a judgment on the question of whether Christ has one energy, one operation, one will, or if he has two of each of those. And Pope Honorius responds in a way that you can interpret it Orthodox if you're giving it a more considerate, if you're more considerate to intention. But back then they were just at the ready to, they were salivating over heretical doctrine, right? So he blatantly says Christ has one will. And it's not easy to understand what he meant, but it's on the record. So when he wrote that, it went back to the East, and the East took that letter from Honorius to Sergius of Constantinople as sort of the green light to bring monothelitism to an imperial legislative status, and so you have a couple of decrees going out. The first one being, bold-faced monothelitism. The second one being agnostic on the question. And so Honorius dies. Nobody gives a hint that he is the cause of a heretical uprising at all. I mean, he had Holy Mass for his burial, and everybody thought of him as a saint. Even the Greeks, because we read from Saint Maximus the Great. I'm sorry, Saint Maximus the Confessor, that Honorius was blessed and sanctified in his the literature he wrote. So it wasn't until 40 years later at the Council of Constantinople 681 where they were investigating on who's guilty of this monothelite heresy. And they had always known, the typical names. There was a list of names: Sergius, Paul, Pyrrhus, different folks in the East. And so they rehearsed those names. But at the council, the Patriarch of Antioch, his name was Macarius, and he remembers why he became a monothelite. One of the reasons was he read those letters from Honorius. So when he was being accused at the council, at that session, he said, "Wait a minute. You guys are condemning me for believing what Pope Honorius wrote." And so the council felt forced to add Honorius's name to the list of people. Now, they were all posthumously condemned. The only person that I can recall that was actually anathematized in live time was Macarius himself, because he did not relent. He said no, he's going to keep to the monothelite doctrine. So yeah, that's what happened. Honorius was condemned 40 years after he had already been buried in Rome, and from that point forward, both a council and the papal tradition held that one of the occupants of Peter's chair had erred, hereticalized, and not just in a private memo.
This was private. He was, I believe, the Patriarch sought out his theological advice, so it is a public, even though it's between the two of them, basically.
Yeah. I mean, Sergius wrote to Honorius, telling him about this triangular problem between Constantinople, Alexandria, Syria, and Jerusalem. And so Honorius knew that his letter was going to be used to put out the fires. in the East. So the idea that he wrote a private letter, it doesn't really have a lot of supporters anymore. I don't think. I mean, I don't see that being defended that much anymore. But that's the situation. So Honorius being an occupant of the chair and issuing a decree. It's a regional but nevertheless magisterial decree, and it ends up getting remembered by that council, the next council in Nicaea 787, and at the Eighth Council of Constantinople 869, where they all rehearse Honorius as not just somebody who fell asleep on the job, or saw the errors. He saw the error uprising, and he decides to turn his face to let the flames increase. Now the language they use is that he was a positive adherent.
Okay.
Through
and that's significant because you mentioned this in your book, because the way I had heard it, well, two things. One, the way sometimes I remember years ago, the late Richard John Newhouse would explain papal authorities, what papal infallibility was. It's not a guarantee it's a guarantee he will never positively teach error. So this would be a big deal because that's what I'd heard about Honorius is that his big problem was he didn't condemn this enough. But apparently some of the councils, and apparently even, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the popes that signed off on this were actual saints, like some of the successors who said, yes, he committed error. They were saints themselves.
Yeah. And what's interesting is the first pope who ratified the anathema of Honorius, Pope Saint Leo II, right in the midst of him doing that, he asserts papal supremacy. So you have the divine institution of the papacy being claimed in the Pope's authority to condemn one of his predecessors. So it's actually so if you dig a little bit deeper, it's actually not something that was interpreted at the time as something that would pour water on the papal claims. Nobody actually had that inference. It's today that we have that inference, but back then they did not have that inference.
Hard to avoid that inference after. But so it is interesting that nobody even raised that at the time. So excellent. Good. And besides Honorius, he mentioned the other major. I think I have this in one of my, where is this?
Vigilius, yeah.
Vigilius, that's it. So this is the other one. So what? Tell the audience about Vigilius. And I admit I hadn't forgotten about Vigilius before I read your book. I had read him somewhere, and so it's more even more convoluted than the Honorius situation. So tell them about Pope Vigilius and why. Well.
Yeah, because what I had not mentioned about Honorius is that in the more developed canonical procedure of the West, you wouldn't be doing posthumous condemnations for formal heresy. That's just not part of the Latin Code of Canon Law. For centuries, somebody should stand trial before they receive something like that. So what's funny is that Rome today is so interested in talking about the papacy of the first millennium. We saw how Ratzinger brought that up, and St. John Paul II brought it up, and Unam Sin, and it's like we're overdue on some examinations, right? We need to look at the Honorius situation. Somebody in the canonical tradition, somebody educated in canon law, needs to address that, because it's still on the record, and it's not something that looks like it would accord with what we understand today as a valid trial, heresy trial. But in any case, in contrast to Honorius, Vigilius was alive when when he had his contest with Greek bishops. And but just to tell a long story in a very short way, Pope Vigilius, he found himself in the midst of a Caesaro-papist kerfuffle. The emperor was trying to unite again the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians, one of the major causes of division in the East at this time, in the 6th century. And the emperor felt like he was empowered to enforce this union. And so he basically took, he wanted to play both games. He's going to enforce what he understood was the condemnation of 3 particular authors. They called them the 3 chapters. Theodoret of Mopsuestia, Theodoret of Cyrus, and Ebus of Edessa. And those 3 authors, they were, especially Theodoret and Ebus, they were honored and accepted at the Council of Chalcedon, but a lot of their writings are Nestorian-esque. And so the emperor thought, well, one of the ways that we can salvage Chalcedonian credibility is if we issue a posthumous anathema to these 3 men. And then that way the Miaphysites will know that Chalcedon did not mean to accept their writings, their Nestorian writings, as orthodox. But the problem is, in the West, those 3 authors were not meticulously investigated. The Theodoret and Ebus were just known to be accepted by Chalcedon. So for the West to condemn them posthumously was to condemn the Council of Chalcedon. And so now you have this debate between the West and the emperor on the 3 chapters controversy. And yeah, feel free to stop me if you need to ask me something.
This comes back to this is again posthumously condemning people again.
Yeah.
That's hard for a modern or any modern. It'd be hard to the thing that comes to mind when you say that is it's not the same thing at all. But I think of isn't it the Mormons who posthumously baptize people? It's how do you perform a ritual that's supposed to be performed on Earth? People have already left this world.
Yes, right.
And so, but I do I study politics, so I tend to have more sympathy for Byzantine emperors, even when they do bad things. So I understand what they're trying to do. It just seems like a weird thing to do.
Yeah. So Emperor Justinian, he's our primary character in this debate, in this whole issue. He writes an edict against the 3 chapters, and he requires all 4 of the Eastern patriarchs to sign, and they don't. One of them does under duress. The other one signs. So Constantinople's patriarch Minos, he signs, but he says, "Listen, I'll sign, but my signature's validity is contingent upon what the Pope says." Right. Well, the Pope saw it, and initially he thought it was unacceptable because it was attacking Chalcedon, right? And that's when he was first met with imperial assault, basically forcing him to either accept this or face some kind of criminal punishments. And that's when Vigilius is taken overseas to Constantinople from the Italian peninsula, and is kept on house arrest in the East until he approves of the emperor's plan. Well, while he was there, the Pope went through a series of rethinking, and he decided to anathematize the 3 chapters. Then when he realized that was going to divide the church, he annulled his first anathema. Then he said we have to hold an ecumenical council of Greek bishops and Latin bishops. But the Western bishops weren't cooperative. So Justinian ran a council with just the Greek bishops and a few African bishops, and then just sort of pummeled through, steamrolled this anathema to against the 3 chapters. Finally, the Pope comes out with a decree. We call it the Constitutum number 1, where he realizes that some of the writings of Ibas and Theodoret are clearly Nestorian. That's unacceptable. He realizes that Theodore of Mopsuestia wrote, he was a Nestorian. However, he wasn't in favor of condemning them posthumously, because he was referring to the records of Rome, of Leo, Gelasius, that were against that concept. And in response to that, the emperor decided to excommunicate the Pope, accusing him of Nestorianism. And at that point,
I know emperors actually excommunicate people in the ancient world.
Well, he could not. Yeah, he could not excommunicate. So he ordered the council. Yeah,
right. The council.
Yeah,
okay.
he ordered the council in the 7th session. He ordered them to remove Vigilius's name from the sacred diptychs in the divine services of Constantinople and the other patriarchs, because he's guilty of the crime of heresy, namely of being a Nestorianizer. And the Greek bishops went along with it, and so that happens in that 7th session, and then they went ahead and closed the council without the Pope. And it wasn't until 6 months later that Vigilius, being stuck in house arrest in Constantinople, decides, okay, fine, I'm going to come around to condemn the 3 chapters and the whole. I'll agree with the council. Now, in Vigilius's mind, the council did not have any legal force.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, so when Vigilius came back to his, when he made his final decision, he thought that was the authoritative decree that ratified the council. I don't know what the Greeks thought about that. They didn't pipe up when he made the claims that he did. And then Justinian actually erased the portion of the council that condemned him for Nestorianism. So it was actually what do you call it? Expunged from the acts. Yeah. And it doesn't get remembered. It really doesn't get remembered. Anytime in the future, nobody remembered Vigilius for that in the greater debates in the centuries going forward. It was known in the East and in the West a little bit, but it never really gets as popular as the Honorius event. So in any case, that's the story about Vigilius, where you have a sitting Roman pontiff being accused of heresy. The bishops decide to take action where they believe that their sentence and execution actually has effect on Vigilius. So and they don't turn around. They're not forced to apologize. Nothing like that. So it's there. It's in the historical record, and it's available for the picking for your Orthodox and Anglican interlocutor.
And they said that they've never made, like, generally speaking, those Orthodox Anglicans haven't made as big of a use of that as they had as of Honorius in these types of debates. It's very interesting. I think the reason why I had forgotten about Vigilius is because it's not direct, but the whole thing, like bringing the Pope, like, where he can watch him, it sounds like duress or coercion, and that's probably why because it's like, oh well, he's not. I mean, he is. They didn't torture him or anything. He's not like, was it Saint Martin, the one that actually he literally gets kind of tortured?
Oh yeah,
died.
Pope Martin. Yeah.
Yeah, he died. Not this isn't quite the same thing, but it's kind of clearly, just he is a very slick guy. So he's come here while we discuss this, and like there's a sort of implied threat. So
No, they all knew. In fact, a lot of Vigilius's friends in the East. I'm thinking of like the Bishop of Milan at the time. He wrote a history of the event, and it was nothing but accusatory towards the empire for being basically what we call today Caesaro-Papist. That's how Vigilius and Justinian were remembered in Rome. Of course, they tried to cover it over because it ended well,
right.
but at the time, Vigilius was definitely being under duress.
Yeah, that does made sense about it. But it is, I believe it's what there's two. There were two times when a living pope was actually accused of heresy. The second one was in the Middle Ages. And that was it John the 22nd? This is the pope who
the one who convened Constance, or it was in the midway.
No, this is theologians. I think in
Paris. Oh, John the 22nd. Yes, about the souls, about the beatific vision where they didn't see it till the end. Yeah.
The only time I don't know if they said heresy. That was the second one time where basically when he's living, he's committed this error this way, and he recants that. So that's a little bit different. I never hear that brought up by the Orthodox at all. At least they don't care. But
yeah, it's interesting. The Vigilius thing that also doesn't put any water on the papacy at the time.
Yeah, so it's not a big, it's not remembered.
Right.
Whereas it did seem like, again, from your book, they did remember a couple centuries later, Photian Schism. They remembered Honorius. That was something that was in.
Yeah.
That's not insignificant that it was part of that legacy there. Excellent. More general questions here. This is about evidence. You do a lot with evidence in the first, you deal a lot with evidence in your book. This is one of the really good things about the book is that you talk about this stuff. Can you discuss the state of the evidence in the first millennium for the dogmas of papal authority? How would you describe how? I guess the state in terms of, okay, is this something that proves the papacy? Is this something for our listeners? Does it, sometimes people, what they want from history is a smoking gun. Aha, right. I found the smoking gun. We've got the bad guy. What is the evidence like for these claims? You do a great job with this in the book.
Thank you for the compliment. And thank you for reading it. It's got to be a labor, to get through that.
It's a good reference if you want to pop in and talk about Vigilius, talk about the formula for Mizdos. There are very detailed chapters on each of these. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think in the beginning of the book, I sort of I don't just jump into like the historical evidence. I try to give an introduction to historical method, what counts as evidence, and for the Catholic dogma of the papacy, I argue that you don't need to go find explicit claims of papal infallibility ex cathedra, immediate, a direct, universal jurisdiction over all the baptized. Because often that's the case when you have like an Anglican or an Eastern Orthodox or some other Protestant kind of inquirer, and they start to basically feel like they've got an edge on Catholicism, and so when they want to do the Sherlock Holmes, where you've got to find Vatican I, You can't just go in there and decide to find this or that. You've got to find the full-blown Vatican I decrees. And I argue that that's not the case. And so I sort of give a minimal facts case where if these minimal facts are proven not to exist in reality, but to have been taught by the scriptures and taught by the fathers and the councils, then both Catholics and Orthodox are bound to those minimal facts. And if those minimal facts are true, then there's only one existing version of Christianity today that still exhibits those facts, and it is logically constructive to Vatican I. And those minimal facts are, I give it in various ways, but Peter is singled out by Christ to be the head of the apostles, head of the universal church. Number two, that primacy given by Jesus to Peter, so that's very important. It's given to Jesus by Peter when Christ was standing in the flesh before his apostles. Okay. Secondly, that primacy, that position of headship, does not die out with Peter. It outlives him in the mode of a successor in a particular place, namely the Roman bishopric. And then number three, that because this primacy is of divine institution, it must last until the end of time, because it is part of the architecture that Jesus himself drew up. So notice I didn't say anything about what kind of jurisdiction, the immediate, direct. I didn't say anything about ex cathedra infallibility. I just said three. You can separate it into five. I don't know. To me, it was three basic minimal facts. If those minimal facts are supported by scripture, tradition, the fathers, and the councils, then Catholics and Orthodox are bound to those minimal facts. We cannot etch them out of our ecclesiology. And so if we can go through the first millennium and see that blueprint drawn out for us, then we don't even need to get to infallibility and the kind of jurisdiction. We can just step back and say, well, wait a minute. Which church today, between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics, still believes in those minimal facts? The Orthodox don't believe them at all, right? Some of them can go far with one or two, maybe, but it's a very small minority voice that can go that far. By and large, Russian ecclesiology is basically swallowing up the consensus today in Orthodox. And so they don't. So in other words, the conclusion to this is, the Orthodox Church gets excluded from being in continuity with the tradition just because of its deletion of those minimal facts. So we don't even really need to get to Vatican I, right? But once we've made that first step, then we can go to the next step and say, well, given that Christ gave Peter this power, this position, the power of the keys, what is logically necessary for a monarchical head to govern the church in the way that Jesus commanded him to? And I think when you chase down the logical implications, all throughout the centuries, they were all driving further and further to this idea of a jurisdiction over the whole church that he can act upon when he feels the need to. The biggest issue was, when and how are his decrees understood to be irreformable? Because as you get into the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, everyone believes the papacy in the West. It's just a matter of understanding whether that gift is singular and whether it could be executed singularly, or it has to be a head and body enterprise. This is getting away ahead. But Yeah. So let me just get back to the minimal facts. I think that the book demonstrates those minimal facts are not just sprinkled, but replete inside the sources of the fathers and the councils. And so what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to tell the Orthodox, how did we etch this concept out of our ecclesiology? Yeah.
And that was one thing that you, when I say thorough, you lay out. There is some notion of the papacy as having a primatial authority over the old church from a very, very early period, which is at times, not all the time, at times acknowledged by Eastern bishops. Again, not all of them, but some of them. And this is something I wanted to go on with that, because you make that point, and it's a good point. I'm curious, you mentioned about the Russian ecclesiology swallowing the rest of Orthodoxy, because I know they basically, I got this from your book, they basically deny there is any universal primacy. There's nothing. It's just a collection of local churches.
Yeah.
Because I remember, years ago, the thing I used to hear was, well, if we can turn the clock back to the year 1000, then maybe we can have a discussion about how the papacy's jurisdiction is exercised, all that stuff. And it seems to me there might be something there more than I would have thought. About 10 years ago, we said, nah, you can't do it. But the more I think about it, yeah, there are some things you might be able to talk about. But if they're going to deny that it's not even there in the first millennium, that does kind of obviate that. I saw this because go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think that there is something of a reform to the papacy that could happen, that would favor the principle of subsidiary regional primacies in these things. And I'm a big fan of that, actually.
Yeah, well, that's what I did have a question about. I won't get into Pastor Eternus, it's too far away from this, but I think, and this has been my thinking about this for a while, is I think everyone acknowledges at some level the church has to be infallible. And the way that it's been defined, again, they won't like the idea that the Pope can do this all by himself, but it's such an extraordinary thing. It's not something you have to worry about on an ordinary basis. I think the bigger problem is the primacy, the way it's exercised, the way that, and yes, current events have made me think about this a lot harder, but like, okay, how does he relate to the bishops? What's their authority? What can he and not do to them? I shouldn't put it that way, but I've been thinking about these things, right? Can you just fire a bishop as if he's your employee? Because I'm thinking about this in the terms of like, okay, if I'm an Orthodox bishop, right? And you tell, okay, you should submit to the Pope. His authority is no threat to you. Oh, by the way, the Pope just sacked him as a bishop for whatever. I don't think that would be a reasonable. If I was an Orthodox bishop, I don't think I would go for that. Is the problem?
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's definitely a good conversation to have. But the Russian Orthodox, they're not really they don't see any kind of universal primacy that has like binding authority. And they're the majority. They're the ones answering a lot of the papalist, they call them papalist claims of Constantinople these days. But I'm in agreement with you that we can look at Vatican I, we can agree to it, but we could also say that there's a lot of other things not treated. At Vatican I, the bishops were asking, what happens if the Pope does this and does that and goes crazy? And at the time, the answers were to trust in the Lord. Okay, of course, but we could have said trust in the Lord all the way back at Nicaea, but that never stopped the church to investigate things. And I think that we're at the point now where we should investigate the limits of papal power according to the various non-negotiable, irremovable laws that we all apprehend, like natural law, divine law. There's just certain things. Even an Orthodox bishop, a local Orthodox bishop, he admits he has jurisdiction over his church, But if he starts firing all of his deacons because he thinks they're ugly, you know, there's just something in the conscience of the common folk that knows that heaven's not happy with that guy, the Lord's not happy with that guy, so something has to be done, you know.
And of course, this actually does come up in the background of the Second Vatican Council. There was a debate about this. The Theological Commission struck down. I remember Paul VI wanted to add something to this, the fact that the Pope had no superior on earth. And they struck him down because then they recognized there are limits to what he can do. This happened. The lecture I'm giving, by the way, on Monday is on the Kulturkampf. And it was during the Kulturkampf. This is the one time that I know a definitive papal statement's been made, and he doesn't make it himself, but Pius IX signs. He basically says this is the mind of the Vatican I Council, which the German bishops are responding to. Again, in this case, a civic authority, Bismarck and the German Empire, because they accused him of being a, quote, perfectly absolute sovereign. The German bishops say no, he's limited by ecclesiastical, natural, and divine law. And so that's the one statement you get on. It's in Denzinger, or it was, last time I checked. And so you do have that there, but it's not something for obvious, and especially at Vatican I, they weren't, the whole purpose of the council was to bolster the authority of the papacy. They were worried. Again, I'm tired of the brain because I've been reading up on this stuff. They were really terrified about what was going to happen. There's a lot of things that seemed to be attacked by all these new nation states. And so in that context, it's very, well, let me give you confidence that, okay, the way the actual definition turned out, at least again, from a Catholic perspective, an Orthodox, I don't expect them to take this way, but like, it's a lot more modest than it could have been, than the more extreme party wanted. And you're right. Someone somewhere accusing Vatican I of being ambiguous. It's not ambiguity. It's just silence on a lot of difficulties they simply couldn't. Yeah. And then that's into the future. And that's what you do when you can't do that. You don't push the envelope. And so, I think people get, again, I understand their difficulties with, I think again, it goes back to primacy, the ordinary, immediate, universal, there are certain, again, this thing about like theology, it's a lot like the natural sciences. The way people use language, like in a very particular, like a very technical way that sounds like to an ordinary person something else. Like when you say ordinary, he can just intervene whenever he feels like it is an ordinary. No, it's part of his ordinary power, which he gets from his office. It's not derived from somebody else. Right.
It doesn't mean that he can be a criminal now.
No, it doesn't even address that. It's just talking about it comes from his office directly, and the office comes directly from Christ. And so that's it. That's all that does. And yet, you can get this, and I've noticed this, and again, it's happened again. Current pontificate, but it's happened before. You will get apologists to the papacy in certain contexts. They'll want to elide infallibility with the primacy, and it's a bad idea because they're different things. And I don't expect anybody to do that in the first century because you're just working those things out. So. Excellent. How are we doing on time? Not too bad on time. A couple more general questions to round us out here. These are. I guess this is kind of. I wanted to ask this question because it was kind of interesting. I know a little bit, not too much about them, but do the is that the word, non-Chalcedonian church, the Coptic, the Assyrian Church of the East, etc., do they differ in any substantial way from the Chalcedonian Orthodox in their criticism of the papacy, in your experience?
There are slight differences. They overlap in the majority. Okay. So they majorly overlap. But the Miaphysite churches. So we're talking about like the Coptic, the Syriac, Ethiopic, India, and there's some Oriental Orthodox. So these are not Assyrian Church of the East.
Right, it's a different thing. I lump them in there. So.
No, that's okay. Yeah, so they view the Pope of Alexandria as the successor of Peter. So they actually believe he is the successor of Peter in Alexandria. He doesn't have a primacy of jurisdiction outside of an appellate structure, and so he's limited in many ways. But it's kind of hard to see all the Eastern Orthodox be all right with that concept. They seem to be, because of Canon 3 and 28 of the second and fourth ecumenical councils for Constantinople. But it's still a debate in Eastern Orthodoxy. So I think they overlap majorly. They see the prelate of Rome as the chief. He's the first chair. But I think the Coptic Orthodox, especially, they're going to have less of an issue with the Petrine foundation, because they believe in a multiplication of Petrine foundations. So they can say Rome is a Petrine chair, Alexandria is another Petrine throne, Antioch's another Petrine throne. This is something that comes up in the patristics as well. And a lot of Catholics today would do well to study that, because it's there in the early centuries. We don't talk about it today. So you can get a dogmatic manualist in the Thomistic tradition, and he'll have no idea of how Alexandria and Antioch are Petrine thrones, and yet all of our popes in the early centuries said these things. So there's something to learn from the Oriental Orthodox. So I think they majorly overlap. They disagree in substance minorly on this issue of like the Pope of Alexandria and his Petrine foundations.
It's an interesting thing though that they have that in common, which is interesting. Okay, kind of a couple of things from your book, and one of them is kind of a what if. Yeah, it's not what if. It's actually it's not even a counterfactual. It's a factual. And I'm going to quote here from your book. Okay, you write in your book that, quote, if it could ever be shown, as St. John Henry Newman admitted, that the magisterium of the Catholic Church has contradicted itself in the solemn pronouncements on faith or morals, and everything written in this book, or any book in defense of Catholicism, would be shattered into two pieces. How is it possible for the claims to be Pastor Eternus to be falsified in this way? How would this be possible given the promises made to Peter, i.e., that you're a faithful? By the way, I agree with you. that's what I'm asking. So don't. So what's this?
Yeah. So there's a variety of ways in which Vatican I can be falsified. What Newman is talking about there, and what I would say to answer your question, is if we ever had a pope come out and require the entire church to give as an assent to divine and Catholic faith to something that is heretical, then you're at the end of the pipe. You're at the point where the experiment has reached its failure criteria. There's nothing to do to remedy that. You have to literally scratch off. You have to scratch your hypothesis and write your conclusion down, and then start fresh. But there's another way. I mean, if, say, for example, if for the next 500 years, the bishops of Rome are just constant formal heretics, to the point where the chair of Peter is becoming like just the notorious heretic over the course of centuries, something like that, which it would be so tragic to have to wait that long to see this. But I think that there's a practical incongruity or a practical unfittingness for the Bishop of Rome to just meet. He's not ex cathedra heretical all the time, but he is basically extra cathedral heretical all the time. So there's some variety and nuance there that I think it can become really ugly, even not at an ex cathedra level, where it's like, okay, look, if this is divinely founded and it's supposed to be the tool of Christ to govern the churches, and yet he's a he came out as a porn star. He's running an underground human trafficking, and it's going on for 2 centuries. It's like it can get to a level where it's like, yeah, this defies credibility.
I asked that because I don't think people realize that's what Vatican I did. They made this claim, and it's falsifiable. It's right there in black and white. If it happens, that's it. Now, one of the reasons I think they did this I've read a lot about this. I've written about this. What they did was kind of ratchet up the stakes for everyone involved with an ex cathedra definition. Now, not just people, because on the one hand, of course, you're bound if you're a Catholic, you're bound by this. But for the person making it, if you do this, because this, in theory, this is what frightened everybody. Oh, he's infallible. But on the other hand, you've made it clear he can undermine his own authority. And it's almost, in a way, I almost think it's kind of genius because everybody's terrified. Because if you do that, you basically destroy the sort of magic of the papacy, right? This is why infallible, all this other stuff. And because going back centuries, people have looked for ways since the Middle Ages to try to restrain the papacy, and they've never found a way. I think, at least in terms of, again, at least with formal statements of doctrine, they have to be so careful now that at least you can say it's kind of done that to a certain degree, because it is right there in black and white. Yeah, you can falsify that, and so it's increased the psychological demand so much that you'd have to be literally crazy to do that.
Yeah,
and I can't see anybody in practice, like if you get to a lot of holy men, even still among I know the bishops are not going through a great time. There are plenty of men who are still holy, but if you're getting that high in the hierarchy, you're ambitious. And the odds you're going to want to undercut your own authority by doing something like that are so low.
Right.
And in a weird way, it's kind of brilliant. As dicey as it was kind of a brilliant thing to do in a way. I don't think the definition of the primacy was so brilliant. That's a different matter in terms of practical effects. But you can see what they wanted to do. You can see what they were trying to do. And I should point out about the Vatican Council. It was not finished. They got cut off by the Franco-Prussian War. The French had removed their troops. They were protecting Rome, and that was basically the end of the Papal States. So they would have added more if they'd had time. That's the other thing. They might have qualified. I really wish they had in retrospect, but in any event. Excellent. Let me see what else I have. Excellent answer. Hold on. A couple more things here. So can I answer that? I guess not too much left. Yeah, I guess a couple of, maybe 2 or 3 questions left, and we'll let you go. First one, and you said that you've kind of answered this, but I'll give you a chance to just make it more plain. In your book, you say at one point that the historical evidence for the Roman understanding of its primacy over the Orthodox succeeds by a quote-unquote eyelash. And so why does it succeed by an eyelash? Is there equal evidence for something like in the first millennium synodality or conciliarism that's compelling?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to clarify that whenever somebody asks me, because
I read, I think it is that close, by the way.
Yeah. So if we're going by volume of evidence, I think the Catholic side has it, right?
Yeah.
But the Honorius event and the Vigilius event, they can pose a challenge when you don't have any of the refinements through developed canonical thinking and understanding the context of Caesaropapism, the nature of the times during these 2 men, Vigilius and Honorius. I do feel like there's enough there to push Catholics to at least recognize that that the church was willing to believe that a pope could be a heretic, and also that actions could be taken against him. And while we might say that we have a few theories as to how that could happen. Like, if you read Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, and Suarez and Bellarmine, we have some swirling theories about it. But in the first millennium, they weren't trying to crack a theory. They just, bam, he's in heresy, boom, And I think that those events have the power to make the debate a little bit of a wrestle, because we've got to like curl up our sleeves and employ ex cathedra versus ordinary magisterium distinctions. We've got to make distinctions between fair trial versus a posthumous unjust trial. We have to make distinctions between the whether somebody can be self-deposed through heresy, or if there's some sort of ecclesiastical action that has to happen before somebody can lose their office as a bishop or as a pope. And so, in other words, it ends up not being just a one-punch knockout. And when an Orthodox brings those issues up, it can get tricky, especially when they cite the original quotations. Because the 6th and 7th century, they were not making ex cathedra distinctions.
Right.
We're making those distinctions later, which is not wrong. It's not illegitimate. I mean, we make distinctions about how the scriptures are fallible for different genres of literature in the Bible. Those are things that happened way after scripture was written. So it just ends up being a little bit more difficult than people often realize. And that's why I think I wrote that.
No, I agree. So I think people need to understand, your book is excellent on this, is that, and I do believe a preponderance of the evidence favors the papal theory. It's like you said, it doesn't favor it. Because there's no smoking gun. There's no slam dunk. If it wins on points, right? Rather than by knockout.
Yes.
And again, if I'm Orthodox and you make that argument, I don't think evidence alone would convince them, right? The historical evidence is not enough. You have to bring other things to bear. You mentioned all the stuff, the canonical issues, things like, and this is something that you address, and like this is something I guess there's no one view of this in Orthodox, but doctrinal development, right? There are some I know are good ones who like there's no such thing. I don't know how you can have a discussion if you can't do that.
Right.
That's tough. That's tough, right?
That's tough.
I mean, you can sometimes hear Orthodox authors and like their sort of knee-jerk rejection, like everything froze in like the year 1000.
Yeah.
I had to do with that. And so I feel like sometimes Plato says somewhere that, what does he say? Oh yes, unless it removes some sort of evil, all change is bad. I sometimes feel like, yeah, that's basically what I believe. That's not quite true, but it's in the laws somewhere. But I actually respect that about the Orthodox. But you can't make. Even with the Orthodox, I don't think you can get to things like Palinism without something like that. You need to have that. And so I get their unease with it because it can be, I think it has been abused a lot, actually. Not just the last, I'd say for a while it's been abused, but that's another thing you have to address. Otherwise, it's like you said, they just don't, I'm not talking about ex cathedra in the 5th century or the 6th century. And so lots of distinctions you have to get to. So. All right, a couple of things to wrap us up here. Yeah, I'm going to ask this real quickly. I'm laughing. I shouldn't be laughing. Because quite honestly, I guess I should say this in my pod. I don't think I've read an actual papal document in well over a decade. So I had to ask about, what is the name of this? The new, again, this is not even a binding document, but the dicastery for the promotion of the Christian unity, Bishop Overall. Have you read this? What do you make of it? Is it even something we should be concerned about? I just had to ask. So.
Yes, I read it. It's tough to read, because you get lost in 130 pages.
130 pages long?
Yeah, well, for me, it was 130 pages that came out.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So, yeah, and there's not if it's going to be like like a movie, like a Master Commander or something like that, I don't mind reading 500 pages. But when it's droning on about how we can reduce papal power, I think there's only a few ways that we can really do that without violating coherence with Vatican I. And so the document is really entertaining all kinds of theories that we all know is not compatible with Vatican I. But to be fair to the dicastery, they prefaced themselves at the beginning saying that this is not, we're just summarizing all of the responses that have come in. And so they in paragraph 9 and 11, they state, this is not a status questionis. This is not a state of the question. This is not a response to the responses. It's not a magisterial position. It's not even a joint declaration. I mean, it's nothing. It's really just looking at what all these different Orthodox, Protestant, even Baptists were given their corner. It's about what all could be thought of. Then there were some suggestions that they said were given to Rome by these various groups. So that's all it is. But I think it was irresponsible because it was surveying all these different incompatible options without reminding us again and again that this is not something that Rome is really taking serious. Because when you just read it for 130 pages, it almost sounds like Rome is open to taking this seriously. But, they prefaced themselves that they were not trying to say that they were leaning in any direction. So I thought it was irresponsible. I think they should have come out with a response to go with it.
Right.
Why publish something like this, and it gets everybody raising an eyebrow as to, they really summarized all this in such a nice, neat way. Maybe they're rethinking Vatican I. Maybe so that's the impression that most people are going to get.
Yeah, that's why I haven't read those documents in a long time.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what I thought it was going to be, unfortunately.
But I'm happy. I'm happy that Rome wants to look at the papacy in the first millennium. Let's get Pope Francis to deal with Honorius. Sure,
absolutely. Have him talk. He's questioned everything else. Why not this? Right? Take a look at that. Maybe not with the current staff around him.
Right.
But yeah, so he would be willing to do it. This is the one thing. He would not be afraid to do it anyway. Everybody else basically is. All right, so we are basically at the end here. One last question to let you go on a Saturday night. Get back to your family. If there is one thing you would want your readers to take away from your book on the papacy, what would it be?
Well, I want people to take away. I want people to gain a basic understanding of the Catholic and Orthodox debate, and to pick up where I left it. Pick up where I left it. There's more work to be done. And I did it as a conversation starter. You say, well, Eric, a 700-page conversation starter, what's wrong with you? But I'm actually interested in continuing my research. I've never taken my eye off of Byzantium. I mean, it's one of my favorite topics. And, this is basically me giving what I honestly can see from the evidence. And I want people to recognize my motives, and then also to go to the next step. Answer me. Maybe there's something to say against what I'm saying, because if there is, then I afford myself the opportunity to be corrected. So yeah, that's I really would like somebody to play tennis with on the other side, on the Orthodox side.
That's wonderful. Somebody, I've been doing a series of my own podcast on the Latinization of the Eastern rites for a long time now. And somebody commented on one of the last ones, like, you almost sound like you're taking the Orthodox side at times. I tell them, look, I'm trying to be fair. And B, I don't hide the fact that I have a lot of respect and admiration for the Orthodox. I do.
Yeah.
I think they're wrong about the basic questions that divide us, but I love their liturgy. I love lots of things about them. I have no hatred toward them. I'm not going to sit here and just dump on them.
Right.
For the sake of the podcast. So you want to talk to people you think you have. The Orthodox, I do think, whatever else, we did at one point share a common faith, and I think it's still there. And so I think it's worth pursuing. So thank you so much, Eric. This is wonderful. The book is The Papacy, Revisiting the Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox. You can find it on Amazon and other places. Yeah, put the book up there. There you go. It's very good. You can find all his books on Amazon. His Patreon is Classical Christian Thoughts. Anything else you're working on? You want to just advertise here?
Yeah, you just keep me in prayer. I'm actually writing a small book on Honorius, so I have a few other projects coming up. But just Facebook, Patreon, YouTube. I continue to output what the Lord allows me to do.
All right. Thank you very much, Erick Ybarra. God bless you, sir. And thank you for coming on Controversies in Church History. Take care, you guys. Talk to you soon.